Welcome to another episode of Grateful by Lady Law, where I interview the people that have made a huge impact on my life. Today, we are lucky to be joined by retired Judge Larry Gendler. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I have known Judge Gendler since my first year of practicing law in Sarpy County. That was about 15 years ago. And when I started working for the Sarpy County Public Defender's Office, I was assigned to Judge Gendler's courtroom in the juvenile court in Sarpy County. And from Judge Gendler, I really acquired a solid foundation of being an attorney by mimicking how he treated the defendants that appeared in front of him. And one of the things that I saw right off the bat is that when you had a juvenile defendant in front of you, you always tried to understand why they were behaving the way they were. And you really tried to get to the heart of the problem, and then you really tried to lean on the people in the courtroom to find solutions for the issues that this child might be going through. And there was a deep level of caring and trying to understand, and that was something that, was such a huge model for me throughout the rest of my career. So thank you for being that person that you were. Not all judges are that way.
You're beyond kind. Thank you. We knew you were a rising star as soon as we met you, to be honest.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And the reason I wanted you to come today is because I know that I'm not the only one that feels this way about you, Judge Gendler, that there's so many people in our community that you've really inspired and have just, been a great role model for. So I wanted to see if you'd be willing to share some of your stories, kind of your background of what got you onto the bench, and just some of the lessons you've learned along the way and some of the people that have also been mentors and inspirations to you.
I was very fortunate. I had a lot of great people around me my entire life.
Yeah. It makes a difference, doesn't
it? It does. Yeah. And one thing I would just add when you talked about court, we would interview youngsters in the penitentiary who were, as adults, confined, and they went through the child welfare system and also the juvenile court system before they ended up in the adult system. And to a person, we learned they never trusted those in the juvenile court system. They didn't trust their judge, their attorney, probation officers, caseworkers. They did trust volunteers, which we found interesting because they knew they weren't getting paid. But that really influenced us on how we conducted our court hearings, because without trust, you're never going to get engagement.
Right.
And we needed them to, we also needed to trust them, but they really needed to trust us.
Absolutely. So where did your path to the law begin?
Luck. I took pre-law in college. I went to the University of Missouri. I majored in government and pre-law. Applied to Creighton and UNL. I decided to choose Creighton because I had some friends that went there. A childhood friend was going to be there in my class. And that's kind of the reason why I chose it. And
you made friends in your experience at Creighton that still you have strong connections today.
Oh, yeah. Creighton, this one friend in particular, who we grew up, I think I met him when I was 14, 15 years old. We have lunch once a week and have since we graduated law school.
That's incredible.
And we have some classmates that we get together with on occasion.
Yeah. So from Creighton, where did you go after graduation?
So I clerked in 1970. I graduated in 1978. So in 1977, I got a job as a law clerk in the county attorney's office in Sarpy. My boss was Pat Kelly, who was one of the finest people I ever met in my life. And one thing that he taught me early on was the most important thing about the job wasn't the power we had, it was the power we didn't use. And then the chief deputy at the time was Mike Wellman, and when Pat passed away in office, Mike took over. And he was a wonderful boss and influence as well, and we still sit next to each other at Creighton basketball games since the late 70s. And the other thing that he taught us was that if we're going to prosecute a case, we need to make sure the evidence is there, but we also need to make sure the ingredients are there. And if something doesn't feel right to you, if it feels like we're misusing this authority, figure out a different option.
Yeah. I think it's really important that office was really aware of the power that they had and that they could use.
And we're still close. Many of us still get together for breakfast or lunch. It's pretty amazing how many of us have stayed in contact.
Yeah. Like-minded people.
Like-minded, outstanding lawyers. I mean, way better than me, to be honest. I learned quite a bit from them.
That's awesome. So from the county attorney's office, that's when you got your judgeship?
It was end of 1992. And at that time, I was the only judge in Sarpy, juvenile court judge. And we had a lot of cases. So I never went through new judge training.
Oh boy, because there's no one to train you, right?
Yeah. So I made mistakes. I'm sure I did. I remember the first case I ever had. And from there, we just moved forward. And I should point out that some of the cases I had as a prosecutor really were a foundation for how I behaved as a judge. One of the gentlemen I first prosecuted, whose name was Joe, had an acute alcohol problem. Kids were taken away. His wife left him. He eventually got his children back. He sobered up, and he became my friend.
Oh, wow.
And we stayed in contact. He passed away last year. But I used him as an example frequently because he had health issues. He had money issues. He never drank again. And he was pretty inspirational to me in terms of what we did and how we did it.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to just you finding the reason why people are behaving the way they are.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I was taught by a lot of people. Ellen Burkowski, who was a probation officer at the time, she became chief probation officer and then head of probation in the state. And she passed away, unfortunately, a couple of years ago. But one of the big lessons from her was behind every face is a story. We need to hear it before we decide what to do. And then I think I've mentioned to you, I have a close friend that's a professional storyteller, and we walked the streets of Chicago one summer after a convention, paying people to hear their stories from the streets, and that had a huge impact on me as well.
Yeah. What were some of those stories?
Well, we met a gentleman who was a former veteran, or I should say veteran, who had a bachelor's degree in engineering. And the last job he had was a line cook. He suffered from mental health issues, PTSD, obviously, and really kind of refused the help that was offered to him. We tried to encourage him to get it. We met others who had careers, families that had disowned them. They were all unique. They were all engaging, and they all were in need of help, and unfortunately they weren't getting it.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
Awful.
Yeah.
Awful.
Yeah, I've just learned, just to help as many people as you can. But you do, at the end of the day, sometimes if you think about it, it just breaks your heart.
It does. So there was a lesson. We had a golf group for about 20 years, and one of our members was the head of the Omaha Gang Unit, and he has since passed away, Omaha Police Department Gang Unit. And we asked him what kept him out of the pen when all his friends went. And he told us it was the guy at the Omaha Boys Club handing out gym towels. And I never forgot that lesson. So it's not the people that wear suits or dresses or who are in authority that make the difference. It's everyday people who try and do the right thing. And so we always tried in our cases to find who in that youngster's life can be that person. And I hope this makes sense. I mean, we all have a lot of knowledge, but fewer people have wisdom.
Yeah.
Life experiences bring you wisdom. And we wanted to find those people that could bring those youngsters wisdom.
That reminds me, I think you told me last time we met about a study. I believe you said that where it said that at a school level, it's usually the lunch lady or the janitor.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So there's lots of trauma tools that are used. One of them is 40 developmental assets, which has been validated around the world. And there's others. And I think I mentioned to you, too, that I'd gone to Singapore to study their criminal justice system just in January with students from UNO and UNL. And that was a fascinating trip. But what that trip told us, and what 40 developmental assets and other trauma tools tell us, is that it's the school lunch people, it's the janitor, it's the people that you and I wouldn't suspect, who really have a lot of knowledge and something that we can gain from that information in helping kids, because kids may not confide with their teacher or their school counselor or their principal, but they will talk to the people at the lunch counter, or they will talk to their janitor. And those folks are an important part. And sometimes that janitor could be the person who's the gym towel guy in that child's life.
Yeah. I think that's fascinating. And a lot of people probably wouldn't even think of that. But I feel like those janitors or, the lunch lady or people in those positions probably will put the time in to listen.
They do. They do. And they notice if somebody's been absent.
Yeah.
And they'll approach them and ask them, where have you been?
Instead of it just being another box checked,
right.
Like it sometimes is.
Right.
That's just fascinating to me. So jumping back to you as a judge,
yeah.
What were some of the experiences that really stand out in your mind? How long were you on the bench? Let's ask you that
28
first.
and a half years.
Yeah, so I'm sure
Long
there's
time, yeah.
There's a lot to go through.
There were a lot of changes. The things that stand out to me really are the changes that we got to see in people and how well they did. We're all fortunate because we went home to normalcy. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of these folks, they didn't have that kind of normalcy. So seeing some of those changes, pretty heartwarming. If I can tell you a story briefly that happened yesterday, I do some volunteer work every Sunday. And yesterday a gentleman came up to me and he looked at me and says, "You look familiar." And asked me where he might know me, so we went through a few things. Turned out he was in our court in 1993 for auto theft. And he had completed probation, got in further trouble, was in the penitentiary. But he wanted to let me know he'd been sober for 18 months and remembered some of his experience in juvenile court and applied some of that to some of the things he's doing today. He looked fantastic.
What a success story.
Well, it just makes my week that he came up to me. The fact that he remembered me, because I can't possibly look the same, right? So I congratulated him on sobriety because it's a huge deal.
It is a huge deal and not easy at all.
Not easy at all, right?
Yeah, that's
it's
awesome.
a real disease.
Yeah. To impact somebody on that level too is such a.
Well, they impacted me.
Yeah.
They all did.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was another case we had. This one I'll never forget. Was a gentleman. We had a lot of military folks, a lot of folks that were in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's impossible for any of us really to imagine what it was like for them unless we were there. Mm-hmm. And this gentleman came back from 3 tours and had 2 of his children's rights terminated by another court system because of his addiction to methamphetamines. Remarried, had another child, lived in Sarpy, and now that case was before us for similar issues. And in court, I said, we're not going to lose this one. And after about 9 months, it was a real struggle. Things were not going well. He was still married. Safe and secure housing is an important issue for a lot of these people, and that's something we always tried to look at. And that was another issue for them. So I had paused. I didn't know what else to try except this. And I asked him if he had ever heard of Sebastian Junger. And he looked at me and he shook his head, yes. And I said, have you ever heard the book War? And he shook his head, yes. And War is a book about Sebastian Junger, who's a war reporter, embedding himself in a military platoon, Marines, in Afghanistan, and writing about that experience. It's a tough book to read, but one that a lot of people, I think, should. Mm-hmm. So then I paused and said, was that you? And he shook his head, yes, and started to cry. We were all moved by that, but after that, I said, we're starting over. And he did better. And as we sit here today, he's on disability. His wife is working, and the foster parents, who without a doubt were the difference in this case, have become like grandparents to this child. And it's something I'll never forget.
Yeah. I'm sure that moment in court was a turning point for him. to be
I
understood.
think so. It was a turning point for all of us. I give him a lot of credit because what he saw was horrific.
Yeah.
And he lost 2 children he loved on top of it.
Yeah. Some people have it so hard.
They do.
Yeah.
They do. And most people, not all, but most people deserve those second and third chances.
Yeah. One of the cases that I remember in your court that really touched me and kind of changed my perspective on everything was a young boy who kept running away from home. And I had him one morning. He ran away from home, and they brought him from the Juvenile Justice Center, and they had him in shackles. And so I went and met with him and asked him, excuse me, why he kept running away from home. And he was in the foster home. And so then, we walk down to your courtroom, we sit down, the foster mom's there, and she starts making fun of him for being in shackles. And I remember you being on the bench watching all of this. And then when it was my turn to plead my client's case, I explained to you that the reason what he told me the reason he kept running away from home is because whenever he was in trouble, this foster mom would either not let him shower or not let him eat. And I remember you getting very, very upset and telling my client, you looked straight into his eyes and you said you will never have to go back to that foster home again. And then you looked over at the DHHS worker and you said he's never going back to that foster home. And he never did. And I think that was a huge turning point in that child's life. And I just remember thinking how grateful I was that we were in front of you, because I don't know if any other judge would have done that. But it was just such a moving moment and just hugely impacted the way I looked at these cases.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I mean, we all deserve to be treated with dignity.
Yeah.
And dignity brings upon dignity, and respect brings upon respect. So.
Yeah. And I just remember thinking, because I know they put him in shackles because he kept running away, and it was like, oh, this naughty kid just keeps running away. But then when we actually found out why he was doing it, I mean, I could even feel a change in how the juvenile justice security, guards or whatever treated him, because it made them realize, like, this isn't just a bad kid. Like, he just doesn't even get the most basic things as a shower and food.
We've had, unfortunately, there are other situations that have occurred like that in our system. Fortunately, not often.
Yes.
But I can tell you a case that we had. On child welfare cases, I always wanted to meet the youngsters at least once to remove that mystery of who might be making these decisions. And I always wanted youngsters to come to court, even if they were 3 or 4 years old. And there were a strip of 3 siblings who would come to court frequently. And I would also let them come see me in my office on the record, as long as the guardian ad litem was present, and the CASA, if they had one, which is a court volunteer, also present. Nobody else. We'd make a record, and I'd get permission in advance from the attorneys to do it. And once they understood my process, where I wouldn't talk about things with those kids that were really germane for the courtroom, not for other discussions, I just wanted to know if they were getting to go to the soccer camp they wanted to go to, or extracurricular activities, if they had their favorite teddy bear or blanket, or visits with siblings, that kind of thing. So this strip of 3 siblings would come see me about every 3 months, and they would come to court and sit in the back. And we had a hearing on a Friday afternoon with them, and the guardian ad litem came in and said, they want to talk to you. And the attorneys gave permission, so we're on the record. Mm-hmm. And they were giving me horrific stories about the foster home. And it's 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. So I called all the attorneys in and had the youngsters go back in the courtroom, and I said, here's what they've said to me. We need to find a new foster home. And, of course, the caseworker said, I don't think I can find anything at 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Well, I knew that one of the students had attended a school where a friend of mine who was a retired teacher was a curriculum coordinator, not current, but had been there. And I asked permission if I could call her to see if there was anybody that might take those kids, with the attorney's permission. So they're all in the office with me, with the caseworker. And this friend of mine said, let me see what I can find out, because there were teachers at the school she had contact with. Well, then she called me back and said, okay, if this isn't long, I'll just take them. So I asked the attorneys if that was permissible. They all agreed. So my friend Sherry took those kids for about a week and a half, until we could find them a foster home. And to this day, I am fairly close to two of them.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do I say this? Sometimes the system works.
Yeah, it's true.
And works well.
And there's good people, and you just have to keep looking for the solution.
Right.
Yeah.
And this system works because there's so many people that care.
Yeah.
Otherwise it wouldn't work.
Right. It's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now I wanted to see if you are willing to talk about some of the people that have influenced you in your life. I know you've shared a few of these stories with me.
Yeah. There's a lot of them.
Yeah.
I'm very lucky. Well, I'll start with 1957, the story I told you. I was fascinated with tape as a kid. Don't ask me why. And we moved in 1957 near 98th and Pacific. And there was a grocery store called Shaver's, and I went there with my mom. And I was born in 1953, so I'm 4 years old. And I wanted to buy a roll of tape. And the store wasn't that big, and I took a roll of tape up to who became the manager. I remember that. And I pulled the tape up in front of him. I said, how much is this? I want to buy it. And he asked me how much I had. So I reached in my pocket and pulled out my coins, and he dropped a few more in my hand and said, now you got enough. And I'll never forget that. Never. And shortly after that, when I started school, kindergarten, one of the first friend I met in kindergarten, Bill, he and I are still friends. We get together a couple times a year. And he was a big influence too, in part because Bill struggled through school. Large family. Drank and smoked too much in high school. He had a neck injury from football. Didn't last in college more than a semester, and went to work for his mom's daycare in the basement of their house. Then they opened up several daycares. Then he sold the businesses and owned the buildings, became a landlord for daycare centers. Then he started a daycare catering business.
Oh, wow.
Did all of this with a high school education, essentially. And I used him as an example sometimes in court, because parents were frustrated their kids didn't want to go to school. And if you're an entrepreneur, if you've got ideas about business, you don't have enough time for school.
Right.
And I just said, if you're focused, and Bill always told me the key to his success was being focused and work hard, that you can be successful. So that story and how well he did and how he turned his life around is something that's really stuck with me. My grandfather and I were really close on my dad's side. He lived to be 102. They came over from an area called Shumps, Poland in 1917 to escape the Russian army. They wanted to cut my grandmother's hands off as a memento for cooking a meal for the officers, which was a bargaining chip to take what they could before they left. So my grandmother insisted she was leaving with their 3 children at the time, and they ended up in Omaha. And he lived to be 102, and I was fortunate enough to be able to spend a lot of time with him. And as I mentioned, I had teachers. I had a junior high teacher, Mr. Duell, who was a huge influence on me. In high school, we had a teacher named Miss Littlejohn, who was the only African-American person in our high school building at the time. She had an influence on me and many others. In college, Dr. Casey was a huge influence on me. He was a professor I had for a couple classes. In law school, one of my biggest influences in terms of thinking was Dr. Shagru, who was my con law professor and criminal procedure professor. I don't know if you had him or not.
I didn't. I've heard of him, but I didn't.
Yeah. And he and I are still friends. I had him in 1975. He lives outside of Denver now. We stay in contact, and I have a son in Denver, so whenever I get out there, I go visit him. So that's just for starters. The number of people who have influenced me, plus where I volunteer, I've been there over 20 years, and I've met people who have a huge influence on me because of the way they've conducted their lives and the way they've learned from their mistakes, which is always an important lesson.
Absolutely. One of the things you said reminded me of one of the things you would often tell some of my clients that would appear in front of you, because it was clear that you know that not every kid is going to go to college, and you would talk about your mechanic to them. Do you remember that?
I do.
Yeah.
We wouldn't exist as a country without these people who are plumbers and carpenters and electricians and people who pick up the trash. I mean, there's so many things that occur that are outside the scope of my world, but make all the difference in the world. And I would talk to them about those opportunities. There was a really good show on PBS about 2 years ago about the trades and how important they are to us. Another lesson, I'll just mention this. When I was a senior in law school, I worked at an apartment complex. And there was a gentleman there who leased an apartment from me, and he was a truck driver. Mm-hmm. And by the way, 99% of everything we use comes from a truck.
Right.
Almost everything. And I said, "What do you do in your free time?" He said, "I love Shakespeare." And I was in his apartment. He had everything that Shakespeare had ever written, which I found just incredible. Mm-hmm. And there's a gentleman, I think his last name is Finney, who wrote a book called The Long Haul, which the book's probably 10 years old. His father was a cartoonist for he wrote a cartoon, I'll think of the name of it. But he decided to quit college and become a truck driver. He's a high-end truck driver. And his story is fascinating. He's really an interesting guy. And the point here being that all these folks have a real story to tell if you listen. And they all contribute to what makes us successful and happy.
Exactly. Yep. And that lesson was not lost on some of my clients. I know that after court one day, I had a student that was you could tell he really impressed upon him that story, because I think that they look at the judge as this all-knowing person. And in court, you had said, I have a friend that's a mechanic. He can fix my car. I wouldn't even know where to begin.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, there was Ron was a mechanic that I used for over 40 years. He's retired now. He could fix anything. And I remember maybe 25 years into my using him, there was an article in the New Yorker about mechanics and how mechanics are like a psychologist who's a therapist, who you when you're working with a client, you eliminate those issues that you consider until you get to the real issue. Mm-hmm. And a mechanic will eliminate certain issues to get to the reason why the car needs to be fixed, or whatever it is they're working on. So I brought him the article, and I said, "You're as smart as this psychologist." And he enjoyed me bringing that to him.
That's awesome. Yeah. I remember my client walking out of the courtroom and saying, "I've always thought about being a mechanic." And it was almost as if you'd given him permission to dream that dream.
Oh, gosh, yes. I don't know if you were still there for drug court or not, but we had a youngster in our juvenile drug court that built silos.
No, I didn't.
At 17 years of age, he was building silos by himself.
Wow.
And we couldn't get him to quit what he needed to quit doing. And I looked at him and I said, "You're one of the most talented kids I've ever met in my life. If I were to take away your tools, where would you be?" And he gave me this blank stare. And I said, "No, I'm not going to do that. But that's what's going to happen if you get in further trouble. You're going to lose your tools.
Yeah.
And you're going to lose what you enjoy doing." And he got the message, but he was incredibly talented. I can't imagine building one of those things with a dozen people, let alone one. But he did it. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I learned in juvenile court too was the adolescent brain development.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and that puts a whole different twist on juvenile court, I guess you could say, and how to handle these kids.
We all made stupid decisions as kids because our brains aren't fully developed. The most important part of a child's life is 0 to 3. So we would always emphasize to parents who came into court with younger children and infants that we wanted to get them screened and evaluated to see if they were eligible for 0 to 3 programming through the Nebraska Department of Education. We wouldn't use those results against them in court. I made that very clear. But those programs and services that we offer in Nebraska for that age group prepares them for kindergarten and really avoids later issues.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it made me realize too, the other big thing too is fetal alcohol syndrome.
Huge.
And it seems like there were so many of my clients that had that, undiagnosed sometimes, but it made you realize why it seemed like it was Groundhog Day with some of these kids.
Yes.
Over and over.
And there's good research. There's a doctor by the name of Bird, Dr. Bird from, I think, University of South Dakota. He's a fascinating guy. We brought him to Nebraska to speak, he got started. He's a physician, and he was at a conference and walked by a room where a different conference was going on and observed pictures of youngsters and infants whose expressions and faces looked similar to his clients. So he stopped and went into the session, and they were talking about fetal alcohol syndrome. He had heard nothing about it, and it became his life's passion to study it and to treat those patients. Yeah. And what his research showed him was that if you caught that early enough, you could put the right supports in place to eliminate a lot of the effects that might occur later on in life. He's a fascinating guy.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's very fascinating, the whole fetal alcohol syndrome and how it really affects how children behave and the way that you can approach them, because it can't be the same as normal children, because they're not going to get the same.
And there are several states that have these huge campaigns to address this. There's one state's called Not a Drop, because a pregnant mother can have 5 or 6 drinks and it won't matter. Another pregnant mother can have a sip, and that makes the difference. Yeah. It's just random how it may affect that child. We had proposed some legislation in Nebraska at his urging that would have asked a mother a simple question that would go on the birth certificate: did you drink during the child's pregnancy? And the reason for that is the birth certificate goes with the pediatrician, does not go to the mother's physician. Mm-hmm. And then if the pediatrician was aware of that, they could be putting in supports to observe and eventually provide support services if necessary. We got a lot of pushback from the Hospital Association and other people that they thought that was an infringement on a parent's right. But the interesting thing in the research that we reviewed that Dr. Bird pointed to was that the vast majority of mothers are honest about that issue. And it wasn't to be used as punishment. It was to be used to provide the proper supports for kids. So I'm still hoping someday that perhaps we can do something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So since you retired, how long have you been retired?
Almost 4 years.
What have you been up to in the last 4 years?
Well, fun.
Good.
We are really fortunate as judges because we have retirement. So I do some consulting and training. Like I mentioned, I went to Singapore with students from UNO and UNL, and that was a fascinating experience. They do a thing there called restorative practice, where they use a lot of circles. And by circles, I mean offenders in the penitentiary and prison guards. They don't call them prison guards there. Meet to discuss common issues. This was all started by a gentleman, Terry McConnell, from Australia, who arrested a youngster when he was 15 because he had been assaulted by this youngster. And rather than issue a citation, he took him home and said, "Come to my office tomorrow morning with your mom," which they did. And he discovered that this youngster's father had died, and as a result, the youngster was engaging in all sorts of bad behavior. So he had him come to his office every week, and he started a circle with other offenders, and that spread all across Australia into a more organized plan, and Singapore adopted it. And some of the things that they were doing there, we were doing here. I work with two groups of judges once a month with what's we call reflective practice. And that's it's a process where you meet with people to problem solve and how you handle your feelings about those issues that you can't really solve the way you like, but this is the best solution available given the circumstances. So I do some of that. I'm part of a conference on Friday. I'm going to be presenting at a conference in September. And I've presented at a conference, for example, in West Virginia. So I get to stay in, and some legislation stuff. So I get to stay involved a little bit. I get to pick and choose what I want. But really, I'm beyond fortunate with what I'm able to do.
Yeah. And it's just so wonderful that you stay connected with this work, though, because you have so much to give.
Well, thanks. I mean, I get an awful lot more than I give, trust me. I really
know how
do.
that goes. Yeah. You also are very active, aren't you?
Well, a little bit.
You're a big bicyclist.
I do.
Yeah.
I bicycle quite a bit. I golf, go on long walks, go to the gym, read. We're all trying to cheat time, so to speak, because at some point time ends.
Yeah.
So make the best of what we have. It's all a gift.
Oftentimes when we talk, I always wonder how you have time for all of this. You stay so connected to friends, and you're so, physically active, and then you're engaged with so many different projects. When do you sleep?
Well, I don't sleep great, but that's my problem, I guess. Like I said, I'm really lucky. I've got several friends who live out of town that I Zoom with once or twice a month. We've been friends forever. I mentioned the one friend I have lunch with every week since law school. And this community offers an awful lot if you want to take advantage of it.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's just you have to get out there. You have to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things you taught me too, is you have to do the work. And doesn't have to be the work, but if you want things to change or if you want things to happen, you have to be involved.
But you get to continue to see great stories. And I love hearing great stories because there's so many.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you start peeling away people's layers.
Yeah, it's incredible. And like I mentioned, my friend Joe, who collects stories, we Zoom and he gives me news stories. He'll talk for 2 hours on Zoom if you'll let him.
Yeah.
But I don't want to call them everyday people because that's not really fair because everybody's unique. But there are so many fantastic stories if we take the time to listen.
Yeah, that's so true. One of the ladies that I know touched both of you and I profoundly that's no longer with us, but she had a good story, is Pam Ostransky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was going to talk about her a little bit towards the end here. So Pam was a secretary that we met. She interviewed for a job in the county attorney's office when I was there in 1991. And she started the interview by saying that she was going through cancer treatment and would have to miss work because of the treatment and the radiation. But she was very impressive. She worked for a law firm out of Lincoln, and when she left the office, I remember Mike looking at me and said, "I think we're done interviewing," which we were because she was so terrific. And we hired her, and then she became our bailiff. And I retired a year before she did. I wanted to leave before she did, in part because she had so much knowledge about our responsibilities. And then she unfortunately passed away last June. But she had 30-plus years that, fortunately, she had. And as it turned out, her oncologist was one of my close friends, but we didn't know it at the time, and he wasn't about to share it with me. And we texted 3-4 times a week after I retired. And just went to Puerto Vallarta to spend time with some friends, and her husband came along.
Oh, that's good.
Which was great. And their daughter's story, I don't know if you want me to.
Yeah, if you.
I don't want to give away too many personal issues here, but our court reporter, who we're all close to as well, had a family member who had been raped by a school bus driver at a very young age, and this was all around the time when Pam was trying to become pregnant, and despite these Herculean efforts, could not. And school bus driver, there was a mistrial, and he had to be retried, and these were all horrific times for all three of us, just because of what our court reporter's family was going through. And the second trial, he was convicted, and we're hugging in my office, and our court reporter, Danette, looked at me and said, well, now we got to find a baby for Pam. And I said, can we enjoy this a few more minutes? And that night, Danette got a call from her sister asking if she knew anybody that wanted a baby.
Wow.
And that baby became Pam and Mike's daughter.
It's incredible.
Incredible. They flew out to Baltimore to get her, and she's 21 now. Yeah. So when you talk about people that influenced my life at the end of my career and today, those are the people that really made an impact on me.
Yeah. Pam was a ray of sunshine, if there ever was one.
Never had a bad day in her life.
No.
Maybe a bad minute, a bad afternoon, a bad morning, never a bad day.
Yeah, and she was going through so much. She was struggling so much with her health. Cancer treatment's not easy, and it's often painful, and you would never know. When you walked in her office, she greeted you with the biggest smile and just beaming with this from ear to ear. And
she also had other complications that some people didn't know about. We didn't really broadcast it. There were times she couldn't be at work, and that was fine with me.
Yeah.
I could not have worked with better people if I had tried to handpick them. And every day I enjoyed going to work, and every day they made me look better than I deserved, truthfully. Yeah.
And it helps, it almost becomes like a family environment.
It was. Loved them all. Yeah.
So another one of the things that you've given me is recommendations for books and movies, and I just can't believe the depth of knowledge you have on all of these things, how you have time to read and watch all these movies and listen to great music. Some of the books that really, one of them that I've talked to you about, but that really stood out to me is The Social Animal by David Brooks.
Right. He's an interesting man. Yeah. He's kind of
right
with me. But that book is really interesting because it talks about the social development of youngsters who live in poverty versus who live with something more than poverty, and how those kids in poverty socialize with adults because they don't go to daycare. They're not able to socialize with a lot of youngsters their age, or sometimes they're left alone. And their world experiences and their world perspectives are so dramatically different when they grow older. And it's really a loss for those younger kids who are living in poverty because they don't get the socialization skills that other kids get. The book is fictional, but it's based upon research, and I found it pretty impactful.
Yeah, it's written so well. It's such a different concept because it's the story of these two people, but it weaves in the research, and it just made me realize how important the social connections we have are, and that depending on what path your life takes, you don't always have that opportunity. So that if you do run into people that are important to you, it's so important to make sure that you glean the lessons from them and not take that for granted.
Right. Yeah. Right. And I've read he wrote a book on, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it's on morality, historical in terms of the United States. And that's a really good book as well. But a lot of his stuff is, woo.
Yeah. Very intelligent man.
He's a bright man, yeah.
So then we're running out of time, as always. It always goes so fast. But there was one movie that really stood out on your recommendations to me, and it made a huge impact in my life. It was Muscle Shoals.
Oh, yeah.
Such a phenomenal movie. And it's about the music that was made in Muscle Shoals The way it was filmed is phenomenal. It is probably one of the most beautiful movies I've ever seen, plus the message and the music, it moves you, and it's just this whole experience. And I watched it for the first time after you recommended it with Walt. And I think we watched it at least 5 times. And it was just he loved that movie. It was great. It was a documentary, not really a movie.
Right.
But after he passed, I look back at all the memories I have, and those were such great memories of watching that documentary with him, and how grateful I am to you for recommending it. 'Cause
that movie came from a recommendation from Julie Bear, who's an attorney in Plattsmouth and a good friend and an excellent lawyer. But the story of these musicians who weren't schooled long, they didn't stay in school long, they're just geniuses, and all the great bands wanted to perform with them. So the Beatles went down there, the Rolling Stones went down there, all the great musicians went down there to record with them. It's a great story. Yeah. Another really good one is the most recent one, I think it's on Netflix, about the making of We Are the World.
Oh.
Have you seen that one?
No, I'm going to have to watch that tonight.
So, Michael Jackson co-wrote that song. God, no, I can't think of his name. Lionel Richie.
Yes.
And all the fantastic musicians that gathered for that one recording session. And Quincy Jones, Q as they called him, who just passed away a few months ago, who was an absolute genius when it came to music, put the whole thing together. It is one of the most moving experiences in a documentary I've ever watched, in part because of how important this project meant to everybody, because it was a fundraiser for food for those suffering in Africa. And towards I'm not going to spoil it for you, but towards the end of the documentary, people were sad that their sessions were ending. It was early in the morning, 5 or 6 in the morning, because it was such a moving experience for them. So I highly recommend it.
Thank you. Thank you for that recommendation for me and my listeners.
Yeah.
We'll all have to check that out. Well, thank you so much for coming, and thanks for everything you've done that influenced me, and I'm sure you don't even realize all that you influenced me and everyone around you. And I'm so grateful for our continued friendship, and for you listening to some of my stories, and I love listening to yours.
Well, thank you. You're very sweet and kind and generous in your comments, and I'll just say I'm really proud of you.
Thank you.
I really am.
That means everything.
You're a model citizen, and we should all. I wish there were more Mandys in the world.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for listening to Grateful by Lady Law. You can find us anywhere you watch or listen to your favorite podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Thank you again, and until the next podcast, stay grateful. Thank you.
A Huda Media Production.